Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today, we welcome back Daniel Batten, who is a tireless advocate for Bitcoin adoption. Daniel, great to see you.
Thanks for having me back, Nick. Good to be here.
Now, I reached out to you to discuss this new Cambridge report on Bitcoin mining, and you're the perfect person to talk to. But let's start with this graphic that you sent me about the occurrences of terms used in online news in terms of Bitcoin. So tell us how this graphic impacts your work and your line of work, your research, and what you do every day, Daniel.
Well, it's pretty simple. We care about Bitcoin adoption, and the reason that Bitcoin adoption is currently slower than it could be is misinformation. Because quite often, when we're to have people adopt Bitcoin, they need to accept it. And to accept it, they need to have good information about it. And quite often we're finding that most people, whether that's investors, whether that's people in retail, whether that's people on the street, doesn't matter who they are, they're often misinformed about Bitcoin. So we're not starting from ground zero, we're starting with having to undo misinformation. And what this graphic shows is that out of all the different attack vectors that have been used against Bitcoin over many years, by far and away, 6 times more frequently, the Bitcoin and energy and the Bitcoin environment attack vector has been used. And this slows down adoption. And whilst there is not nearly as much media reporting on this anymore, the damage has already been done because there was for a period of 4 years. And now 60% of the population believe Bitcoin is bad for the environment. And so they're against Bitcoin at a core value level. And just to kind of imagine that scenario, imagine the internet. If 60% of the population were against the internet at a core value level, we could never have had mass adoption. So this matters. It impacts my work a lot. And it's really the starting point for a lot of the education I do around Bitcoin mining and the environment, Bitcoin mining and energy, aka Bitcoin mining.
Today's episode is sponsored by our 3 fantastic partners, Unchained, Blockstream, and Stampseed. Bitcoin isn't just a balance sheet asset, it's the benchmark. On May 14th at 11 a.m. Central, Unchained and Strive are hosting a live online event. Every business will buy Bitcoin. The discussion will explore why capital allocation is being redefined through a Bitcoin lens, how performance looks different when measured in sound money, and why building a Bitcoin treasury is becoming a strategic imperative. Make sure you RSVP today at unchained.com/TBL. Blockstream Jade Plus is the easiest, most secure way to protect your Bitcoin, perfect for beginners and pros alike. With a sleek design, simple setup, and step-by-step instructions, you'll be securing your Bitcoin in minutes. If you want more security, Jade Plus supports multi-sig wallets, so make sure you check them out. Protect your Bitcoin, sleep better, and stack harder. And make sure you use code TBL for 10% off. Go to store.blockstream.com. Do not write your seed phrase down on paper. This is why we use Stampseed, a DIY kit that enables you to hammer your seed words into a durable plate of titanium that uses professional stamping tools. These titanium plates are heat resistant up to 3,000 degrees, rust proof, crush proof, and time proof. Go to stampseed.com today and use code TBL for 15% off of your order. Now this graphic here, it shows that 120,000 times Bitcoin energy and 68,400 times Bitcoin environment are part of online news articles. And the next closest is Bitcoin criminal at 21,400, and the next closest is Bitcoin money laundering at 5,430. It means that you can see the old narratives falling to not used anymore, meaning Bitcoin is useless and Bitcoin is worthless. They see the price going up. They also see that using Bitcoin for criminal activity has been not entirely, but more or less obsoleted going back many years due to chain analysis. And so this attack vector of branding Bitcoin with misinformation is a topic you and I have discussed in the past, originating mostly from Europe. So can you speak to the current diagnosis of the geography of Bitcoin misinformation?
There's really a number of different sources, and we can describe them as a trinity of central banks. So the Bank of International Settlements, the European Central Bank, and the Central Bank of the Netherlands have been the chief three architects of putting out information on Bitcoin, and particularly Bitcoin mining, which is unfavorable. And then, in addition to that, what has happened has been that neutral reports and neutral reporting agencies such as Cambridge, at the time when it was reporting that Bitcoin was mostly fossil fuel driven in 2001, 2021, 2022, a lot of media coverage. Now, when it's saying the opposite, that it's mostly sustainable, crickets. Not a single major news periodical has picked it up. No one. And so maybe that's because bad news makes better headlines. But whatever the reason, what that's created is an environment where you now have a population who's been fed information which we now know to be at best no longer correct, at worst never correct about Bitcoin mining. It's formed a prejudice against it, that it is bad for the environment. And the media very clearly is going to make no efforts to correct that.
Now, let's get into some of these graphics from the report. Let's start with the share of miners utilizing off-grid power at 26%. What does that mean? And just to reset for the viewer and the listener, we are trying to dissociate Bitcoin from its misinformation campaign over the last several years. That is what Daniel's mission is. Or I'm sorry to speak for you. Maybe you can clarify, but I know
part of the mission.
I know it's part of the mission. So let's get to some of these graphics so that we can dispel this misinformation and explain to people where Bitcoin energy, Bitcoin mining, where this industry is today using the actual numbers.
So this graphic is showing that there's a lot more off-grid mining than people suspected. Now, Cambridge reporting, to clarify, they're saying 26% of the mining companies surveyed were doing off-grid. The percentage by hash rate is smaller. It's around 8 to 9%, but it's still quite significant. Our own estimates show that it's much more than that. But either way, there's a lot of mining that is happening off-grid. And most of that off-grid mining is using renewable sources, sustainable sources. And there's a very simple reason for that, and that's that the reason they're mining off-grid in the first place is that they're seeking the cheapest source of energy, and that cheapest source is often on an oil field in the form of flare gas, which otherwise would have gone into the environment in the form of methane. Or it might be a wind farm, such as Mara, who's recently bought an off-grid wind farm, 114 megawatts, that was actually causing all sorts of issues on the grid and have helped now to bring it off-grid, but to provide stabilization services back to the grid, because it was built in a place where there was actually a surplus of energy. And so we're now getting to get that data on the amount of off-grid mining that's occurring and how that's often solving a lot of issues such as stranded energy that can go nowhere. And our own company, we're specializing in stranded energy on landfills, and that's 100% off-grid because that's where you have no option to sell the power to the grid. It's an environmental hazard. But if you can get Bitcoin mining units co-located on a landfill itself, you can harness that stranded energy. And what we're likely to see over the next couple of halvings is that's going to increase because mining economics will necessitate that you have to get the cheapest source of electricity possible. And that means you're going to have to look for more off-grid, more stranded, more otherwise wasted sources of electricity.
Before we get to the next graphic, perhaps you can give us the big picture view on how you approach, how do you explain it quickly to people that Bitcoin is changing the way that we consume energy as a planet, or that we're even designing electricity grids? Just give us that big picture take on why you believe Bitcoin is changing the world of energy.
It's already happening, and it's something now which has been backed up by so many case studies. So what we've seen is that we've never had a consumer of energy ever in history which has been so flexible And that flexibility comes in the form of you can locate it anywhere, but also you can switch it on and off, and it doesn't interrupt any processes. It's running hundreds of trillions of processes per second. So you don't lose anything like you do when you switch off an AI algorithm, or when you switch off the lights on a hospital, or when you switch off any number of other businesses. We've never had that before. And the second thing we've never had a consumer of energy where 80% of their entire operational budget has been power. And that does something very unique. It means that for a Bitcoin mining unit, they will go to lengths that other businesses will not go to chase cheap power. And so it's not as though Bitcoin mining companies are more virtuous than other industries. It's just that the economics and incentives align, that they have no option but to go to look to say, where can we solve problems? Where can we help stabilize grids? And where, for example, can we not only earn revenue from Bitcoin mining, but where can we earn additional revenue? And that additional revenue often has incredible value to humanity. It may come in the form of what's called demand response, where you are getting paid to power down your operation to bring stabilization to the grid. It's a service that's existed for 20 years, but we've just never had as flexible a user as Bitcoin mining that can provide that. And so now that's a service that's available to the grid. And because Bitcoin mining can do it as well, demand response becomes more competitive. That means prices for it go down, which saves money to residential consumers of energy. So it's incredible in terms of how much flexibility it gives. I was speaking to a person who works at TEPCO, that's Japan's largest utility, recently, who estimates that if you don't have Bitcoin mining, you can forget about a net zero emission targets. You can just forget it. Once you hit about 50% renewable penetration on grids, it starts to max out because you have so many challenges in stabilizing that intermittency. Plus, you need backup in the form of gas peaker plants. So when the sun goes behind a cloud, the wind stops blowing. But he says if you're using Bitcoin mining to shock absorb the variability of that renewable generation asset, you can ramp right up to about 70% penetration. So it's become essential to having energy systems which are both low cost, energy secure, and also decarbonizing at the same time. So it gets us away from this tyranny of the political left favor decarbonization, the political right favor energy security, and then they get into fights with each other. With Bitcoin mining, you can actually have both together.
Now, people might not know this, but Daniel helped me include TEPCO in my book, Bitcoin Age, which people should go check out. The audiobook is also now available. He said I sent him the passage that I had about Bitcoin and its impact, or Bitcoin mining and its impact on energy consumption and how it's changing this world. And he said, don't forget to mention TEPCO, because their use case is so exemplary of what we are discussing here. I have a couple questions about where else in the world this is happening, but let's go to this next graphic: emission intensity by estimation method. So can you explain what this graphic is demonstrating for us?
Emission intensity is a standard way that engineers and environmental regulators will measure the impact of a particular industry sector or a country. And so what it's doing is it's measuring the grams of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per kilowatt hour. In other words, how many emissions is it emitting for the amount of power that it's using? And it's a really good, it's like the difference between measuring GDP versus GDP per capita. So it takes into effect the total energy use. So it's a very reliable metric. And it also helps us a lot because in the past, people who have been pro-Bitcoin have defended Bitcoin and said, well, it uses very little energy compared to the banking sector. But that's not actually a very good defense because it's tiny compared to the banking sector. So we need to have oranges for oranges or apples for apples comparisons. And energy intensity does that because you can compare the energy intensity of Bitcoin as a network compared to the banking sector. And what we find is banking is around about 350 plus grams per kilowatt hour, whereas Bitcoin mining is around 266, I think it was, according to Cambridge. So it's significantly less than the banking sector. Now, this is important because one thing a lot of people don't take into consideration is that Bitcoin doesn't just create emissions out of nowhere. It's obviating something else. So when, for example, I'm transacting and I'm using my Satoshi wallet, I'm not using the banking network. When I'm using Bitcoin as a store of value, I'm not using gold, which is what I used to use in the past to fulfill that same intention. So I'm obviating another industry. I'm obviating the banking sector for that portion of my transactions where I'm using Bitcoin Lightning Network, and I'm obviating the gold industry when I'm using it as a store of value. And both of those industries, the banking sector and the gold mining sector, are way more emission intensive compared to Bitcoin. So there's an argument that this is not only is it creating fewer emissions than we imagined, but in the same way that an EV replaces a fossil fuel driven car and therefore it's net emission reducing, exactly the same argument can be made with Bitcoin.
Okay, so that survey number of 288.2, that is the figure here that is much lower than the banking industry. The other two are other methodologies. The next graphic, annualized greenhouse gas emissions by estimation method. We have here the survey at 39.8 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is a 43% decline from the CBECI, which I believe was taken 3 years ago.
Correct. So there's been a lot of reporting again, attempts to estimate the total emissions created by the Bitcoin network, and what we now know is that they've been vastly overestimating for a very long time. That's a simple summary of that. I think the other thing that's important to note here is, so I'm a climate tech investor. Every single investment I've made has a carbon footprint to start with. Direct air capture has a carbon footprint to start with. The photovoltaic industry had a carbon footprint for the first 57 years of existence before it paid off its carbon debt. So any new industry, even if it has the potential to be net decarbonizing, such as solar, such as Bitcoin mining, such as direct air capture, will always start off with a carbon footprint. So that's not important, and that's been often that information has been relayed without context. What's important is, does it have the capacity to pay off its carbon debt, and how quickly can it do so?
Now, in this next pair of graphics, we break down that emission and that electricity consumption, and we break it down by what type. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you see the current survey that shows 38.2% of the electricity mix for Bitcoin mining is due to gas, right? And 23.4% due to hydro, 15.4% from wind, a very small portion from solar. So talk about this electricity mix, and note that only 0.5% here are from fossil fuels.
What it's showing us is that it has changed substantially. And now, in aggregate, it's saying 52.4% is coming from sustainable sources, and the other 47.6% is coming from fossil fuel sources. So that's changed remarkably from what was reported a number of years ago. Most of the reason for that change has been that the Bitcoin mining that used to occur in China and in Kazakhstan is no longer occurring in Kazakhstan, and the mining that is occurring in China is mainly either it's on the grid or it's using renewable hydropower. So that's resulted in a tremendous shift. And in parallel to that, you've also seen more methane mitigation. You've seen just general more gravitation towards sustainable energy sources. A lot of that mining hash rate that migrated out of Kazakhstan and China went to the United States, but it also went to Paraguay, 100% renewable. It also went to Bhutan, 100% renewable. It also went to Ethiopia, 100% renewable. And you see that in all three cases, the form of renewable that it is hydro. So there's no great surprises that of that renewable energy mix, the major renewable energy source has been hydro. It's just a form of energy which loves Bitcoin mining because often you get surplus of hydro during the rainy season and it just flows over the top of the dam, or you are selling it to a neighboring country at less than you can procure by selling it to Bitcoin mining companies.
Can you tell us a quick story about that dam in Ethiopia that has led to the production of Bitcoin mining facilities and all the rest?
The dam in Ethiopia is a great example of this because what often happens is you get these large projects which are often funded by IMF or World Bank, and they're always overbuilt. So a dam, for example, will be built for some future capacity, not for today's capacity. So there was no one who was using that additional energy. And as a result, no one had built out the transmission lines to serve rural populations. There wasn't the money to do that. And there wasn't the incentive to do it economically because it wasn't particularly profitable, if at all. And now you've had a whole number of Bitcoin mining companies that have come, and suddenly it's given the dam operator, the utility company, a massive injection of new revenue that it would not have got, or it would not have got as much of because it would have sold it more cheaply to some neighboring country. And with that revenue, what they've been able to do is accelerate their time frame to be able to build out transmission lines. So as a result, those transmission lines are now going to rural communities in Ethiopia who are getting power earlier than they otherwise would have. And if you think about the debt burden of that country, they're able to meet the interest repayments much better because they're getting more revenue for that project.
Can you talk about the build out of transmission lines around the world? You can pick any country or a mix of countries that you want and demonstrate for us why Bitcoin mining is affecting the build out of transmission lines aside from this Ethiopian example that you just gave us.
There's a couple of things at play here. One is the building out of transmission lines. And the second is avoiding the need to build out transmission lines, which sounds ironic, but I'll give an example. So whenever you have more renewable energy that comes onto a grid, then often you need to have major substation upgrades. But also often renewable energy such as solar and wind is built where land is cheap. And why is it cheap? Because there's no one there. And so the population center is at a different place to where the energy capacity is being built. And because a lot of these projects have been built using subsidies, the subsidy was given to build capacity. It wasn't given to provide value or to provide delivered power to consumers. And so a lot of that power is isolated, it's stranded, it's not able to go over the existing transmission lines. Now, what do you do in that case? Often the utility doesn't have the money to be able to upgrade them. And if they did, it would result in a massive hiking of electricity costs for everyone. And then you have the secondary issue, which is you have AI data centers coming onto the grid. And because they are very inflexible users of energy, because a lot of them, particularly the inference AI, needs to be up 24/7, 99.99999% availability, then that requires fossil fuel. It cannot run off variable renewable energy. And so to be able to deliver that power, again, the grid operators often have to upgrade the grids, which are very expensive. They often have to put more gas or coal onto grids. That's the only way that they can meet those power demands. But when you have Bitcoin mining that comes on, because it's able to ramp up and ramp down its electricity usage very quickly, that relieves a lot of pressure on the grids. It means you don't need to upgrade them. And it also means if you have a renewable generator, then you have someone who can use that power at the site, which means that solar operator, that wind operator now has a customer. They're getting more revenue, and with that additional revenue, they can do what any prudent business owner does, which is to expand their renewable operation. So it's not only helping to build out their transmission lines, Nick, but it's also helping grid operators who have constraints, who don't have the budget or the money to build out transmission lines, to defer expensive costs on the grid, which keeps the prices low for consumers today.
And just quickly talk about AI and how that has affected Bitcoin mining, perhaps in Texas, or if you can give us any examples from any other jurisdiction.
One of the most exciting existing uses for Bitcoin at the moment is this problem I alluded to. We have a large AI data center. There was a case in Ireland recently where the Irish grid operator actually said, no, we don't want you on our grid, even though they were going to pay a lot of money, because they would have put such a burden on the grid that it would have meant the amount of capital they would have had to pay to upgrade the grid would have been more than they would have received in the power contract with the AI data centers. So they said no. What we're finding now, though, is there was a recent report put out by Duke University that showed exactly what we're talking about, that when you have Bitcoin mining on the grid, it helps to defer that infrastructure upgrade costs, and it also helps to stabilize the grid. So AI data centers are now going, well, we don't have to pivot to be 100% Bitcoin mining. We could be 97% AI and 3% Bitcoin mining. But just that 3% gives us enough flexibility that now we can go to a grid operator and say, we are a flexible load resource. When you need power, we can deliver not 100%, but we can give you that little 3% buffer that'll help you to stabilize the grid. And that is precious to the grid operator, because then they can look at the grid loading and they can say, well, that means we can avoid some grid upgrade costs. That means we can use this consumer as part of our demand response programs to help stabilize the grid. So not only are Bitcoin mining companies becoming AI companies, but we will in the future absolutely see AI companies start to become Bitcoin mining companies. So the convergence is now happening in both directions.
I'm regretting now from our first episode not having a ticker, a counter in the top corner of the screen that goes up 1 point every time Daniel mentions something that's bullish for the Bitcoin asset class, but maybe people will do that for themselves at home. Let's talk about hardware retirement. 11.1% of Bitcoin mining hardware to be retired within the hash rate. What is the significance of that number?
This is one of the parts of the report that really pleasantly surprised me. One of the biggest attack vectors against Bitcoin has been it generates a lot of e-waste. Now, that information came from a 5-page opinion piece in the form of an academic commentary, so not a full peer-reviewed academic study, many years ago, that was based on anecdotal evidence, not empirical data. Now Cambridge has gone in and they've got the data, and they have properly measured the real e-waste story for the first time ever. And what they did is they not only looked at the total volume of materials being used, but they also considered, well, how much of this is being recycled? How much of this is being reused or redeployed? And how much of this has been resold? And what they found is when they factored in those different factors, that most of it, more than 80% in fact, was one of those three categories, which meant very, very little was actually creating e-waste. And when they did the data crunching on this, they found that that figure of something like 30 plus kilotons of e-waste per year was vastly overstated, and it would be no more than 2.3 kilotons per year. Now, that's the worst case scenario, because that's also assuming that the original study done on e-waste, which said that Bitcoin mining rigs live for about 1.7 to 2.3 years, is correct. Now, we know that's incorrect. We know they last for at least 5 years. So if you take into consideration the lifespan as well, then it doesn't mean we're about 10 times overstated or 15 times overstated. We're about 20 to 30 times overstating the actual estimates of e-waste. So it completely rewrites the whole narrative. It basically rips up, it trashes the e-waste myth. So that's what that bit of measurement is saying. And we're fortunate that Cambridge, remember, they are seen as the gold standard for policymakers and regulators about Bitcoin. So this is significant because in Europe right now, MICA, the European market authorities, European Central Bank, are busy working together, drafting legislation about Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, which is based on some of these early and incorrect and debunked academic commentaries, which have now been superseded by proper data-driven empirical research from Cambridge. So we'd rather it happened 3 years ago, but better late than never. And now we have some really good data to challenge and go back and say, hey, you're drafting policies based on studies which we now know are wildly overstated.
Yeah, it is all very Marxist with the control of the information flow, very reminiscent of that type of political approach out of Europe. In this slide, we see that 75.8% of these respondents repurpose, sell, or donate outdated mining equipment for secondary use or refurbishment. So that's basically this idea that the mining hardware that goes out of use, out of productive use for the miner itself, doesn't mean that it just goes in the trash can, right? The vast majority of it is being repurposed in some way.
And that's going to increase because what Bitcoin mining companies have realized recently is that you can actually earn money on old rigs by recycling them. So there's no incentive to throw them away when you have an equipment recycler who will say, we'll pick them up for free and we will pay you money to take them off your hands.
Now, in this last slide, I want to get into the historical evolution of SHA-256 ASIC mining hardware, plotting the computing power, which is, of course, the total hash rate of the network, against the efficiency, which is joules per terahash, otherwise said as the amount of energy consumed to hash with SHA-256, which is, for those that don't know, SHA-256 is Bitcoin's mining algorithm. So that is the computing function that the mining hardware has to run in order to mine Bitcoin. And to mine Bitcoin successfully, you have to hash over and over again. That's why these hashes are measured in terahashes. There's a bunch of zeros in a terahash. So explain this plot that the mining hardware itself is getting more efficient. That's what this chart is telling us over time. But get a little bit more into how this impacts the Bitcoin mining and energy landscape.
Basically, what you're watching is Moore's Law in effect with Bitcoin mining hardware. So just as every 18 months, the amount of information you could fit on a silicon chip would double for a long period of time, you're seeing Bitcoin mining hardware become way more efficient. Now, there's a limit to how much this is going to decrease energy usage. So, for example, if we have a landfill and we have capacity for 4 megawatts, if you suddenly have hardware which is twice as efficient, it doesn't mean you're going to use less energy. We'll just put twice as many miners on that site to utilize all the energy on that resource. So what it does mean, though, is that some of the early ridiculous projections of Bitcoin using all the world's energy by 2020, they were created by people who didn't understand Moore's Law. In other words, they assumed that computer efficiency of Bitcoin mining hardware would stay exactly the same as it was today, plus it would get more prevalent around the world. And that's where you arrive at some of these ridiculous estimates and junk science, frankly, without any appreciation that mining hardware improves over time.
And so what we actually then witnessed over the last 10 years is Satoshi Nakamoto's difficulty adjustment impacting the efficiency of chip energy consumption. Would you argue that that is correct?
I don't have an opinion on that one, to be honest. I haven't looked into that deeply.
Okay, so what my thesis there, Daniel, is that when Satoshi designed the difficulty adjustment, that is what causes these red dots to increase over time, because you have to hash more in order to win Bitcoin in the Bitcoin mining game. And so as the number of hashes increases over time due to 400 odd difficulty adjustments over the last 16 years, every time that difficulty goes up, you incentivize producers of ASICs to make them more efficient and consume less energy. So it's more that maybe it's just that Satoshi understood Moore's law and built some mechanism into the Bitcoin network that accounted for Moore's law itself and technology becoming more efficient. Just like you, it just popped into my head something that I wanted to mention there, because when we think about Satoshi's design, there are potentially design elements that we can't fully appreciate even 16 years into the game. And the way that Bitcoin mining has evolved might be one of them. Daniel Batten, thank you so much, as always, for shedding light on these important topics around Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin energy consumption. Please tell people what you're working on, what you're writing right now, where they can find your work, and what is exciting you at the moment.
Right now, we're working on doing some projects on landfills in Latin America, which are going to be using Bitcoin mining and finding areas which are currently emitting vast plumes of methane, unburnt, directly into the air, and turning that into electricity and using that to power the future of sound money. And where they can find me is at DS Batten on X.
Fantastic. And we do appreciate your contribution, because the narratives around methane emissions and grid stabilization are in chapter 14 of Bitcoin Age, my book. And I appreciate everything that you're doing to help the research move forward, and delivering facts to people, because that's what people need to make their own decisions. Daniel Batten, thank you as always. I'm Nick Bhatia. We'll catch you guys next time.
Thanks, Nick.